Third session. Sort of. I have some housekeeping I need to take care of. The biggest challenge I've had with this remote thing is technical. The video processing of a 50-minute video, which is pretty much what the last one was, takes almost 3 hours. And then it takes forever to get it uploaded. I think I've worked with Paul behind the scenes a little bit to resolve some of that time lag, which is why I missed the most recent spot. So I think what I'm going to try to do is shorten up my sessions. So while it will ultimately end up being about the same amount of time, I think my videos are going to be a touch shorter. I will try to find a conceptual breaking point and then maybe add a video that they can roll in however they see fit. Second, I was thinking, as I was finalizing some pieces of this presentation little earlier today, Mountain Time. In my second session, I directly challenged the framework of the fall of man. And I think in an effort to invite you, the listener, to think new thoughts about this, I think I was a little too equivocal. And so I've gone back and forth in my head. I mean, I posed the question, and I think they were very provocative. And I suspect there are plenty of people out there, in as much as they're listening to me and taking me seriously, they're like, oh my God, did he actually say that? But the more I thought about it, I really did think that I was too equivocal, that it was really kind of open to discussion. Now, while I think the details are open to a discussion, I think you're on the hook, having been confronted with the questions, to make a choice. A lot of people like to keep, particularly when they encounter me, and my very unique take on Western history and Christianity and so forth, they tend to, they like wiggle room. John, you're extreme. I'm really actually not all that extreme, but the fact of the matter is that that's a very common, since I'm not a moderate, since I'm not moderating my position, that somehow that is disqualifying. And then people reserve the right to smuggle in whatever bits and pieces into their own body of thought they choose. And and they kind of take the attitude that if I say Plato, they say Plato, tomato, tomato, who cares? I just believe the Bible. Well, we're going to talk about this a lot. The fact of the matter is that nobody just believes the Bible. The fact is that 21st century men, it's a fantastically naive and fantastically arrogant presumption to assume that you in the 21st century have somehow unique and keen insights into biblical literature that, well, pretty much nobody else has. That's just retarded. Sorry. Actually, no, I'm not sorry. It's bad logic. It's bad thinking. So I need to put a much more fine point on this. The historic realities matter because the ideas, and of which the fall of man plays a foundational and pivotal role in very specific outcomes. Or said another way, the fruit of the subsequent doctrines is disaster. Even a casual reading reveals that Augustinian theology and Calvin are at the root of all Western civilization tyranny. With the exception okay, I guess I do have one caveat, Western civilization, and maybe I could make the case, well, let me finish my thought. There is, of course, the tyranny that showed up in Soviet Russia, and of course Soviet Russia was atheist. But the foundation of Marxism that led to effectively Bolshevism and that revolution is Kant. And Kant is the heir apparent of Calvinist. He is the secularization of Calvinist doctrine. So Even in that regard, and this is one of the reasons that I insist that Calvin and Calvinism is the single most disastrous body of doctrine ever perpetrated on the minds of men. Because by virtue of Calvin laying the intellectual foundation during the Enlightenment, when Christianity was, the oppressive nature of Christianity and the closed-minded nature of Christianity was being laughed out of existence during the Enlightenment, Kant was able to find a secular explanation that is effectively Calvinism 101, which makes sense because Immanuel Kant was a Puritan. His family was Puritan, had been brought up in that tradition. So the roots of Western civilization tyranny have a solid home in Augustinian thought, a solid home in Calvin's IRC. The Dark Ages were dark on principle. And the Dark Ages were, the standard of life was misery, suffering, toil, and war. And for Calvin, the ink wasn't even dry on the ICR, the Institutes of Christian Religion. Yeah, I missed that in the last, in my last presentation, I had the acronym wrong. The ink wasn't even dry on his book, and he was appealing to the King of France to use his armies to wage war in behalf of what he considered to be Orthodox doctrine. And by contrast, the Founding Fathers, who were absolutely the sons of the Enlightenment, men who had inherited a human ability, a rational capacity, and fully believed in man's ability to govern himself, no fall of man there, they sought to put absolute barriers between government run by free men and the zealots who ran the Massachusetts theocracy. And it, again, 30 minutes of your life and you can go out and validate what happened when a bunch of Calvinists got a hold of civil government and how they treated people that they deemed were witches. And in the modern age, the tide of Calvinist destruction is washing across the face of American piety. It's duplicating yet again generationally what has always happened. Calvinism runs its course. Subsequent generations run kicking and screaming from the implications. Then the doctrine kind of gets lost, and other tides and ebbs and flows of doctrine show up, and other things socially happen, and eventually someone 2 or 3 generations later says, hey, wait a minute, I found the authentic Christianity. And then somebody rediscovers Calvinism and then goes the next move. And so that cycle repeats itself and repeats itself. And every couple, 3 generations, the people remember why Calvinism was such a disaster. Well, here we are once again. And about 20 some odd, 30 some odd years ago, came one more resurgent move to discover real Christianity, which is also known as Reformation theology, which is Protestant doctrine. Now, in the modern age, and the one thing about America that is so unique is that Americans, and because we are the product of the Enlightenment, we are almost viscerally, we think it is an existential, obvious thing that we are entitled to believe whatever it is we want to believe just because we believe it. We think we get to pick and choose our ideas just because, well, it's our divine right. Well, that is a fantastically unhistoric concept. And the fact of the matter is that the modern day Calvinist preachers don't believe that one lick. They think they are in charge of what you should be believing. And they're not apologetic about it anymore. It takes less than about 20 minutes reading comments and posts off of the average discernment blog in America to find out that there is a real problem in American Christianity. Blackmail, extortion, sexual scandal after sexual scandal, people hounded to the point of suicide. The list is long and disastrous. I expect that the reason you're listening to me now is because you have suffered and continue to suffer at the hands of men who claim to have the specific right to shepherd your soul. And I told you earlier that there is always a dispensation. In this construct, there is always someone who is exempt from the corrupting power of their own sin, or they use the corrupting power of their own sin to absolve themselves of heinous, heinous things. The preacher stands up there and tells you, how much of a sinner he is Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, you think, oh, the humility, oh my God, he's a man of God. And then you find out he's been doing the secretary and the chick down at the local Waffle House, and he's been embezzling money. And then he stands up and he tells you, how dare you judge him? We're all just sinners. Don't you know that if you judge me, God's going to judge you? Oh, and by the way, I'm going to be back here preaching next Sunday. The only thing that tends to get any of these modern day Calvinist preachers kicked out is when they're honest about what the doctrine really says. As long as they're kind of subterfuge, as long as it's kind of under the radar, as long as they use that endless bit of Calvinist doublespeak, they are constantly redefining terms. As long as they're doing that, no one seems to object. But the moment they tell you exactly what Calvinism really is, the moment they tell you what Reformed theology really is, as soon as they move past Luther's 95 Theses, of which he gets all the credit for, no one ever reads the Heidelberg Disputation. No one ever understands what he really said and what he was really all about. The great reformer. Go read, go find, go do the homework, and you will find out that these men are deliberately and specifically hiding things. And this, of course, is what I wrote about, and I did not bring my prop again. Oh, dang it. I didn't bring my book. This is exactly what I wrote about in Blight in the Vineyard. How they use a lot of doublespeak and a lot of subterfuge to introduce truly disastrous ideas, undercover not calling it Calvinism. And then when people are so invested and so committed, finally starting to be honest. And yet they still won't be honest. I have talked to, not so much recently, just because it's mostly a waste of time, but I don't know how many times I have walked up or talked to a Calvinist and they'll say, well, Calvinists don't necessarily believe everything John Calvin said. And I'm like, what? That doesn't even make any sense. The logic being, as good Americans, they feel fantastically justified in picking and choosing whatever body of ideas they want to believe at the moment. And this opens up an entire pantheon of intellectual inconsistencies, particularly in light of the fact that the fundamental thing they want you to do is submit to their authority. Here is what the discernment blogs will never tell you, and it will also tell you how good at discerning they really are. The problem is the doctrine, of which the fall of man plays a central and foundational role. So this is why the gospel according to John Immel 3:1-3 is so crucial. To understand the true motivating power behind group actions, when you see people taking consistent action, if you find the assumptions behind those actions, you will find the cause. And here's the thing, the logic will always be refused. It doesn't actually matter how crazy the ideas are. Eventually, they will fall in line, tick, 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 tick. And the outcomes will produce exactly the same body of outcomes. Remember I said that the most consistent philosophical framework wins. And the people who are most consistent in fidelity to their own ideas are the ones who consistently act out to the logical conclusion. And modern day Calvinists are duplicating what has happened over and over and over in Western history. And unless you, this is my fine point, unless you make a very determined choice to rethink the whole of your worldview, that's a big task, no small order. But this is what's really required of you. Intellectual independence requires personal responsibility to your own brain and its content. Unless you do this, it's impossible to resist. And if you can't resist, you'll keep waking up every day feeling that same fundamental, queasy, disconcerting, conflicted, that whole philosophical, it just doesn't line up. That thing on the inside that doesn't let you sleep, that anxiety, the threat, the fear, that they might come and counter you or reproach you or call you names in public or defame you. It's your job to start to rethink these things. So I touched on the subject of interpretive methodology in my book, Blight in the Vineyard. And I introduced hermeneutics and exegetics in a very brief high level. And the reason I did is because there are very specific interpretive methodologies that reinforce the historical Christian synthesis from Augustine to Calvin. There are very specific tools that they use to arrive at those conclusions. And as long as you don't recognize or realize, and well, I should say this, and they are fantastic at pretending they are the only theological game in town. And so to the uninitiated, to the people who don't know that there are really very robust other interpretive methodologies that are essential to truly understanding the content of the anthology that we call the Bible. And I call it that for a very specific reason, because it is an anthology. I want you to remember always that it is a compilation of books that was put together long after the final writer, the ink dried in that last page. And that matters because it spans thousands of years, endless cultures, lots of language differences, overwhelming numbers of intellectual evolutions. And that doesn't even account for the translations, the root languages, and then the subsequent translations to other languages, and the translations of translations, to the final point where we get to the 21st century. So these interpretive methodologies, they are new, which of course, if you say that to some people, they go, well, if it's new, it can't be true. Well, that's ridiculous. The fact of the matter is that human knowledge advances, we learn more things, and I don't fundamentally believe that just because man learns something new, the point of God's relationship with man is not to keep man infantile. The point was a relationship of equals. And the fact of the matter is that God, being genius, certainly man has the capacity to match and to meet, like any good father. You want to see your kids grow and mature. Well, we've grown and matured. We've learned a lot of things. Now, it's called higher critical methodology, and that title spans a lot of various types of sources and forms of scientific inquiry. These methods began to emerge during the Enlightenment, of course, when knowledge was exploding. And of course, the dogmas, the traditional dogmas, were being challenged. And the things that you could never challenge and question were suddenly you could. And people started to say, well, wait a minute, that can't be true because, and then they would offer a new piece of information. Well, so the Enlightenment during the 17th, 18th century, and those methodologies, I think the first guy to introduce this was a guy by the name of Schleiermacher. I cannot for the life of me remember his first name. But he introduced the hermeneutical and exegetical framework, or at least the introduction to those things. And so it's gotten increasingly more robust over the course of the last, couple hundred years. The reason it has gotten more robust is because so many more people, using the methodologies, lots more people doing actual research into the backgrounds and histories and cultures, and how that interacts and plays with our understanding. So I really wish I had the best primer, absolutely hands down, that I've ever read. I've read a few, but I think the best primer is Fee and Stewart's How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. I really wish I had my copy, my very well-loved copy, but I can't find it. And now you see a picture on your screen, and you see my basement. This is the house we bought about 3-4 weeks ago, and we're still trying to sort it out. So it's in those boxes somewhere. But I highly recommend. Here it is on Amazon. This is not an affiliate link. I wish it was, because I truly am a capitalist, so I wish I could make some money on this one. But it wouldn't change my endorsement, even the fact that I don't get any money for it. Now, my endorsement of them is not to say they would endorse me. I've read enough, and it's been some time, so caveats and addendums aside, they're still very beholden. Fee and Stewart are still very beholden to the orthodoxy throne. They are still very much, and as are most academics. There are very few academics in modern Christian universities that can honestly stand up and suggest that they're going to reject at the root Reformation doctrine. Most of them just don't have the courage to do such a thing. Unless they, of course, are Catholics or some distant fringe, but certainly not if they're like Fuller Theological or Dallas Theological. That is never going to happen. I doubt very seriously they would endorse me. However, which I find some bits ironic because their methodologies, the hermeneutics and exegetics, or exegetics and hermeneutics, I think in order, that they advocate directly challenge many, if not most, of the historic interpretations that are common throughout and endemic to 21st century Christianity. And not least of which is it goes directly to challenge the Protestant academic. They always have a desperate need for peer review and validation. Their livelihoods depend on it. So they're never going to go, oh, yay, verily, let's challenge the Reformation. But it does undercut at the root the home of all proof texting, and that is systematic theology. And that is Augustine's love affair, that is Luther's love affair, that is Calvin's love affair, that is Jonathan Edwards' love affair. The proof texting comes from what is known as systematic theology, and I'll talk about that more here in a few minutes. So much of what I'm going to talk about pretty much is taken from their book, the first few chapters. Highly recommend you go get a copy, of course, and read the later chapters. There's a lot to know. Whatever I wouldn't agree with pales by comparison to the methodologies that I think are of value. So the first thing to understand is that we all must interpret. All of us. Every single last one of us. And there's a very specific reason why. There is no such thing. When have you ever heard something, well, like, clearly says this? The Bible clearly says this. When was the last time you heard somebody say that? Well, my guess is, was probably if you went to church, it was probably the last week. Here's the problem. There is no such thing as a plain reading of a Bible text. It doesn't exist. Because the nature of 21st century, because you, as a 21st century literate person, reading literature, much of it written 2,000, 3,000, maybe some 4,000 years ago, the presumption that you can clearly understand just by virtue of the process of literacy is a profound conceit. It is stunningly naive. And people do it all the time. People say that kind of thing all the time. Now, for all of Calvinists' insistence on humility, there's one thing that they never have is humility over their Bible reading. They assume they own it, lock, stock, and Bible. So, the Bible was not written to everyone. Now, you're like, what? No. Yeah, it was written to me. No, it wasn't. It was not written to you. You were not in the author's brain. Whatever magical consecration you ascribed to God when you were handed that book some years ago, and you took it very personally that God wrote it in your behalf, that's a nice sentiment, but just not true. The fact of the matter is that each writer had an audience, a very specific audience. There were very specific people they were trying to address. This is crucial that you understand that. That specific audience wasn't you. Meaning, your very subjective frame of reference is not nearly enough, not within light years, of being able to grasp what is in the pages of this anthology. Not possible. I will also go on to add that the writers of this anthology did not expect their work would be compiled into an anthology and read as if it's all connected. They wouldn't have begun to know that. The author of, say, Leviticus, commonly ascribed to Moses, probably not specifically, at least in its final form, written by Moses, lots of scribes, lots of people redacted, lots of people added. And I guarantee you, none of them thought, hey, someday they're way at the back end of this book is going to be this revelation, and it's going to apply to this, and it's going to actually foreshadow this. None of that's true. They would not have thought of that. They could not have thought of that. It would not have been within their realm of understanding. And it's obvious that this is true because the Bible spans so many different eras, cultures, and literary types. Most often in total isolation from other writers, editors, and compilers. They wouldn't have been aware of each other on any level. Interesting factoid, by way of comparison, notice that in the book of Acts, Luke makes no reference. While he references the cities that Paul goes into, he makes no reference, to my memory, he makes no reference to Paul's writing. He makes no cross-reference to the writing. Now, we may understand, we may extract because we have both and, but it's entirely possible that Luke had no knowledge that Paul was writing, or whatever he would have had, it might have been very, very obscure. This is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. While Luke has a knowledge of Paul, he doesn't necessarily have an in-depth knowledge or even the copies of the letters that Paul wrote. So let's talk about, I just said that the Bible spans different eras, cultures, and literary types. Let's talk about literary types because it actually has vast implications. If it wasn't intended to be read as if it's all connected, you also have to understand that each writer used various ways of expression to say different things. And off the top of my head, it goes something like this. There are narrative histories, there are genealogies, chronicles, laws of all kinds, poetry of all kinds, wisdom literature. When I say wisdom literature, I mean like Proverbs, right? Dramas, biographical sketches, letters, parables, transcriptions of sermons, oral histories that were eventually compiled, and metaphorical political diatribes. Now, I specifically wrote it like that because the moment I say apocalyptic literature, your brain will go, oh, I know what he's talking about. I'm going to say it again, metaphorical political diatribes. And that's not just the book of the Revelation. That's also Daniel, and that's also in Ezekiel. Apocalyptic literature were metaphorical political diatribes. And the reason they were written the way they were is because, well, for the same reason that Republicans don't want to talk when Democrats have a hold of the IRS. If you are being direct and critical of Democrat government, what happens? They target you. They use their power of government to destroy you. So, hey, what do? We write books and we use metaphors and we use symbology in an effort. So the people we're writing to know what we're talking about. But the people we're talking about have a hard time going, oh, yeah, you're talking about me. I should chop your head off. I did that off the top of my head as I was sitting in front of my computer, so I might have missed a literary type. But the point is, there's lots of different kinds of literature in this anthology. And to understand what is being said to us in the 21st century, you must first seek to understand what was meant for the original reader. This process of understanding is called exegetics. Once you understand what was intended for the original reader, then comes the very specific challenge of applying those ideas to our contemporary context. This is called hermeneutics. The first exegetical principle is, ready for this? Got your pen ready? Okay, write this down. Here's the first exegetical principle. A Bible passage cannot mean something it was never intended to mean. Write it down. So for instance, if you read a passage about washing hands, the writer, say in the 1st century, or even in the 10th century BC, did not mean to give a theological valuation of germ theory. You know about germs because of advances of human understanding. They may have taken advantage of hand washing because it washed away germs, but the writer wasn't giving a theological justification for germ theory. It cannot mean what it was never intended to mean. So if you decide to preach a sermon about germ theory based on hand washing in Leviticus, It can't mean that. So, say it with me. A Bible passage cannot mean something it was never intended to mean. The second principle is think in whole thoughts. The greatest modern sin of Bible interpretation is the practice of extracting 4 or 5 words from a sentence and then emphasizing those words as if that's the point. Now, this practice comes from systematic theology. My degree is in systematic and historical theology, which means I read a lot of systematic theologies. When I was in college, I think the leading evangelical version was Millard Erickson's systematic theology. Henry Thiessen's systematic theology. Who else? Who else have I read? Gosh, I'm blanking at the moment. Of course, there is the rehash of the rehash of the rehash. What is his name? The Calvinist guy that just rewrote another systematic theology. Wayne Grudem. I said his name and I didn't fall asleep. That is one of the most boring human beings ever to talk about God. Anyway, his is a rehash. His is not unique. It's only trending more and more and more openly, blatantly Calvinist, but for the most part, his is a rehash. He's a rehash of a rehash of a rehash. There are any number of systematic theologies, and it is the process of going through every Bible verse and compiling each Bible verse and then stacking them all together. So you get all the Bible verses that talk about man and, from Genesis to Revelations, and then you decide, they all actually interact. And we can actually put them all together and we can see systematically how this works. No, that is effectively little more than cut and paste. Since we read it and we presume, again, a theological assumption, that it's all designed to be read in concurrence to everything else. While there may be harmonies between some books, they were not designed to do that. That is an extra canonical conclusion. So by virtue of taking and lifting snippets of information and applying them in other locations, that gives interpreters enormous power to create and fabricate doctrines out of whole cloth. It is a corrupt interpretive methodology. Now, my degree is in it, and so for the longest time, I thought it was the bee's knees. I understood why at some point it was called the Queen of the Sciences, which now looking back I think is absurd. How can it be the queen of science when it is entirely subjective? All it is an endless quest at arbitrary categorization. But here's the problem. It's practiced and taught with impunity in colleges. Pretty much every preacher that comes out of seminary and or any Bible variant, frankly, I don't care about the denomination, that's what's taught. That's what they see practiced. Yeah, well, I looked up this passage here, this verse here says this, and this verse over here in this book, it says this. And that's how we know God intended us to understand this. It dominates the whole of 21st century Bible reading because it's all anyone is ever exposed to. You see it from the time you go to church. And so, of course, when people read the Bible, that's what they do. They thumb through, Alakazam Poof, they find that devotional moment, they read the verse, and they decide that it's that's what God wanted to say to them. Even though it's not a whole thought. Chapters designations, verse designations are very often dead square in the middle of a sentence, dead square in the middle of a paragraph. And what you have to do is stop doing that. It is a very tough intellectual discipline because it is so easy to gravitate to those textual demarcations. I suppose one time I knew when chapters and verses were actually added, but of course that's not how the original writers wrote. Moses on Mount Sinai, scribbling down whatever God's telling him about creation, isn't sitting up there going, now wait, what verse was that again? No, he's writing out the thought. He's writing in whole thoughts. So learning to see the whole thought, and the whole thought very often spans, paragraphs and paragraphs and chapters and chapters. Learning to do that is a very specific intellectual discipline. And it's crucial that you learn to do it, because without it, you'll never begin to unravel what the Calvinist aficionados, what these zealots and tyrants are doing to you. The practice, this cut and paste practice, is what gives Augustine and Luther and Calvin such broad license to create all kinds of doctrines out of whole cloth. It's what gives modern day preachers the power to splice passages from Genesis with passages in Revelations, two books written thousands of years apart with no common audience and virtually no common culture, to create whatever intellectual bulwark they choose. To get out from underneath the Reformed theology tyranny, you must transition from thinking like Calvinism, the cut and paste systematic theology variety, into thinking exegetically. Number one, a Bible verse, something in the Bible can never mean what it was never intended to mean. Number two, learn to think in paragraphs. Learn to think in whole thoughts. Writers and speakers talked in full sentences and full thoughts, but to our great detriment, chapters and verse references and numbers give us little or nothing to do with full thoughts. You must learn to ignore those designations, which will also lead you to stop stacking up Bible verses to make your point. Stop doing it. First of all, it's a waste of time. I've said this before, I'll repeat it. Calvinists believe they own the Bible stacking debate. They believe they own it. And the moment they realize they can't peg you down on their particular Bible stacking, they usually accuse you of all manner of evil, and then they just quit. Stacking up Bible verses as a rule is based on a fundamental intellectual error, and the conclusion is likely false. That's a bold statement, I know. It doesn't change the facts. When you start to learn to read in whole thoughts, when you start to learn to see the whole argument that's being laid out by the writer, and that's obvious, it takes a lot of work to get there. Some of the stuff is buried. You're like, what the heck is he talking about? And the reason you don't know, the reason it isn't obvious when you do that, the reason you can't find, an endless list of devotional moments is because it takes a lot of work to figure out what the original author was saying and what the original hearers were hearing and what he was trying to do with that. And in some instances, there are no sources to know that. And that just leaves you stuck. So, to reiterate, you must learn to read the whole paragraph and the whole thought. And, what did I say before? A Bible verse cannot mean what it was never meant to mean. Now let's talk about the intellectual process for exegetics. So, every time you read anything in your anthology, I want you to ask three fundamental questions. Who's writing? Who's the audience? What is the occasion? Say it with me. Who's writing? Who is the audience? What is the occasion? So, what does this mean? What time frame? When was this literature written? What was the age? The millennia? You got to know that before you can begin to have any sense at all of what's actually happening. Then ask yourself, what did the audience hear? What would they have understood? Was it originally an oral tradition handed down for generations and then compiled for later generations to read? Because this happens a lot. You'll have a series of ideas and thoughts that are expressed, and it's talking about, say, people during the time of Abraham. But the actual people who would have read that would have been a few hundred, maybe 1,000 years later. And they were reading it and were gleaning information in their cultural context. So while the narrative is, say, about Abraham in his time, the writer is compiling it for somebody much later. Which also leads to another point. Was the passage later edited or redacted by scribes? Now, this will scandalize some of you. A lot of the books have a person that's attributed to them. It's usually, Jude or Ruth or whatever. And we tend to assume that whoever's got the title on the book is the one who wrote it. And that is actually not really consistently true. Now, there are some people who, of course, did write their books. There's no reason to doubt that Matthew wrote his, that Luke wrote Luke and Acts, etc. But by contrast, lots of books were compiled, and they were compiled by scribes and editors. So you have an anthology of, say, an anthology, and this is very common throughout the Pentateuch. Now, literary criticism, textual criticism, these are disciplines and sciences that there are very smart people who study this kind of thing. We don't have to go into detail. But you do have to understand that the content isn't authoritative necessarily. Well, actually, I would like you to get away from the notion of authoritative. But it doesn't specifically have value because one person specifically wrote it. Because we consecrate that person with some divine mandate. If it's true because it's true, not because somebody specifically wrote it. So the fact that there is a scribe or somebody, an editor, refining knowledge and understanding for somebody else, that doesn't necessarily detract, but it does matter in our understanding. The other one is, do we have more than one audience to consider? For example, Jesus spoke to an audience. He had many sermons. Sea of Galilee. He's standing around talking to people on the side of a mountain. And Jesus had very specific things he wanted that group of people to hear and to understand, and they had a broader context. Somewhat. Matthew, they project, was written, if my dating is correct, somewhere around 45 AD. Somebody will probably write a note and tell me what year it was. But so substantially after Jesus spoke. And Matthew also has an audience. He specifically uses words that help his audience understand specifically what he's trying to explain to them about Jesus' life. So what is the intent of both? So now we have layers of understanding. The next thing you have to understand is culture, geographical, and political factors. Let me think of a really good example. I should have done this before. I should have had this locked and loaded, right? Geographical and political factors. Did you know, for instance, that there were three, if memory serves, there were three other men walking around saying a lot of the same things that Jesus was saying, that they were the Son of God, and that they personally were the one anointed to deliver them, and then inviting people into the desert to follow them. Now, the reason they invited them is because they were trying to capitalize on the Moses motif, that salvation would be found if they followed them into the desert. And you will remember that Jesus told his disciples that when he returns, don't go into the desert. He was telling them geographical, political information to prevent them from basically following these vague wanderers out into the middle of nowhere. These kinds of details will dramatically impact how you understand what's said. And then the next thing I want to talk about is literary context. What kind of writing is it? Is it poetry, prose, parable? And again, thoughts are made up of full sentences and full paragraphs. And the reason this is important is because various types of literature does shade the intent and the meaning. What is trying to be done with that piece of information, with that piece of writing? For example, would you expect to organize a country around the poem, The Road Less Traveled? Well, of course not. What is it, Robert Frost, The Road Less Traveled? Would you try to found a country on it? Would you look at it and go, oh, that was a great parable, we should build a country? Well, of course not. By contrast, would you criticize the Declaration of Independence for being bad poetry? And of course, that's not true. Both documents, whatever your value quotient is between each document, but they all had different purposes. And the nature of the understanding, we understand the road less traveled, is deliberately a metaphor. And we would not read it as such as a consecration of human liberty, rights, and freedom. But we read the Declaration of Independence and we know that's exactly what that's about. So the same is true for biblical literature. The kind of literature matters. The methods and techniques used in telling the story, they matter because they shape overall what the Bible is trying to say. So like, for instance, Leviticus is not the same kind of literature as, say, Proverbs or Ezekiel. Proverbs, wisdom literature. Ezekiel, some of it, good portion of it, apocalyptic literature. And when I say apocalyptic literature, it has its own characteristics. The grand visions, the outlandish imagery, all that stuff was very common in that genre. Now, we have only canonized, when I say we, I'm saying 21st century Christians. We've only canonized a small percentage of it, but Ezekiel was not the only person to ever write or talk like that. These differences, the differences in the kinds of literature, dramatically impact what the text was originally intended to mean, and limits what the audience would have heard and understood. Why? Because a Bible passage cannot mean what it was never intended to mean. Interpretive methodologies. Because a passage cannot mean what it was never intended to mean, not all interpretations are valid. I'm going to say that again. I just heard something buzzing, that's why I looked away. Because a passage cannot mean what it was never intended to mean, not all interpretations are valid. Because not all interpretive methodologies are valid. And there are two that I want to take direct issue with. One is allegory, and that is each passage is converted into a figurative story. So this was actually the historic interpretive methodology. This is Origen, for example, used a lot of allegory to make his case. It was very common all the way through up till Augustine. Augustine is the one that started to initiate that proof texting, that cut paste systematic kind of methodology. And I've already ranted about the systematic thing. So those two things should be very suspect in your mind. Now, there are metaphors. There are symbologies. And they do have meanings. But everything isn't a symbol. And everything isn't an allegory. There aren't hidden meanings. And the moment we start talking about hidden meanings, you should get extraordinarily skeptical about the nature of what the preacher is saying. We would all like to pretend that we have somehow secret insights. We're somehow special. We want to be part of that special group that has insights that nobody else has. I get the temptation. But stop. It's not true. And the fact of the matter is that most knowledge, if it's true, you usually have to shove it down somebody's throat, so you don't have to worry about being unique, ever, if you have the truth. But the trend and push towards novelty is an absurd preoccupation. The fact of the matter is, just represent reality correctly. And you'll be stunned, how that isolates you, because how many people have no interest in reality as such. But more importantly, you will be intellectually consistent. You will be using your rational faculties to their highest and best abilities, and that's a great thing. And, what am I going to say? A text cannot mean what it was never intended to mean. Let me talk to you about translations, or maybe better said, understand the interpretive assumptions of the translation group. It matters. So, some translations are the work of one person. Well, okay, so Luther and the Gutenberg Bible. I'm pretty sure that was some one-man show. Impressive work, impressive feat, even though I disagree with Luther's doctrine pretty much across the board. But nonetheless. But lots of modern translations have actually been done by committees. And it's important to understand the theological pedigree of those committees and what their interpretive assumptions were. Were they trying to be literal? For example, the King James. Now, granted, the King James is a translation of a translation of a translation, but nonetheless, the translators were trying to be literal from, what was it? Oh, for heaven's sake, it's been too long since I've thought about that. But nonetheless, it's a translation of a translation, but they were still trying to be literal, so it tends to hold the literalist line. Were they trying to be a dynamic equivalent? So, for example, a dynamic equivalent would be something like a translation that renders candle under a bushel, a very first century concept, to flashlight under a box. You see what they did? So instead of holding the first century framework, they tried to take, without doing any real damage to what was trying to be said, they tried to take it into a realm that the average reader in the modern age would understand. Or were they trying to render every passage and phrase in common 20th century, 21st century vernacular? Actually, I think in the 19th century there was a cotton patch version that was written to, if I remember correctly, and I don't mean to be rude, but to largely illiterate black populations. That's why it was called the cotton patch. They tried to make it as vernacular driven as possible because their audience, the audience to them, was largely illiterate and all they understood was the local colloquialisms. Were they trying to shape, and this is another one, and this is very possible and very likely, particularly with the version that I'm already talked to you about, were they trying to shape the text with theological presumptions? And for example, the ESV. This is the Calvinist movement go-to Bible. And the reason is because it has a whole string of theological interpretations built into the translation to harmonize with passages in Reformed theology. So they've done, I personally think it's duplicitous, because ultimately they have presumed a theological construct and then superimposed it on a Bible translation. So you pick it up, and if you're uninitiated and you don't understand what's there, it's very, well, see, it says so right there. Well, yes, it says so right there. And in actual fact, it has what the theological preoccupation is the byproduct of the cut and paste theology that I've been railing against. And this, of course, gives their proof text debates enormous power. They have a ready-made proof text that automatically satisfies all the foundational intellectual work to arrive at that theological conclusion, and then it just propagates the theological conclusion. And then, of course, like I said earlier, when somebody says something is biblical, what they really mean to say is that it's unassailable, that it's intellectually unimpeachable. So to challenge what is biblical is to challenge God. And well, how dare you do that? When really that's not what you're doing. What you're really doing is challenging someone's intellectual conclusions. And of course, Calvinists can never make that distinction because they think whatever they think is what the Bible says, and what the Bible says is whatever they think. So we have this endless tautology. And I'm going to warn you, in Bible stacking debates, you cannot out-authority the authority. You have to unravel the poor theological translation before you refute their doctrinal point. And trust me, it will just never happen. So now let me switch over to hermeneutics. The challenge of hermeneutics is taking ideas from, say, 2500 BC and find a modern application. Is the cultural colloquialism a transcendent truth? This is no small task and filled with lots of it depends conclusions. You read a passage in the Torah about milk baths for women. And you're like, why? What was that about? And so do we want our women in the modern age taking milk baths? And, maybe there's some value to it. Maybe there's not. Maybe it has no application. Maybe it's at no point of transcendent truth. But the root, regardless of the it depends and the caveats and addendums and all the work you're going to do for good exegetical foundations, is, what am I going to say? It can never mean what it was never intended to mean. If the author didn't intend it and the audience could never have heard it, it cannot possibly mean that. So now last, or not so much last, a comment on commentaries. Because most people don't know when a book was written or the culture that it was around it when it was written. They go find a commentary to fill in the gaps. Okay, I get it, and they should. There are lots of resources out there. But here's the challenge. Good commentaries, particularly in the modern age, that will give you a lot of the background on culture, the kind of things that will help you read in the context that I'm talking about. They are high-level academic work, particularly about ancient Israel. And understanding ancient Israel is key, of course, in my mind, to understanding anything that happens. They're really very dense academic works, and they are not good devotional material. So if you're looking for somebody to pat you on the head and tell you a warm fuzzy because you won't like that in the Bible, that's not this. This is real intellectual work. I do have a couple of examples, people that I have read. One is E.P. Sanders, Practice and Belief from 6 BCE to 66 CE, or Judaism. You can read the title. I've also got another one by E.P. Sanders, Jesus and Judaism. And probably one of my all-time favorites, he writes a lot about, his name is Richard Horsley. He writes a lot about the time frame from about 50 BC to about 50 AD, give or take. One of my favorite ones of his is Bandits, Messiahs, and Prophets, or Prophets, Messiahs, and Bandits. I'll look it up and I'll put it up here when I finally do the edit here. These guys, and these are just examples, there's been a lot of really outstanding academic investigative work over the course of the last 50, 40 some odd years. Certainly the linguistic background to the Old and New Testament. There is a guy, what is his name? David. This popped into my head, that's why it's not in my notes. The Jerusalem Perspective. What is his name? David Biven? Jerusalem Perspective. Highly recommend. A lot of great scholarship on David Biven's site. I remember when I first encountered him and he was talking about that Jesus probably really didn't speak Greek, and he probably, while he might have known some Aramaic, he was probably likely fluent in Hebrew, and that the nature of Hebrew would have been the primary language spoken in and around him during his time. And this was a major theological debate when I was in school. And I think they have long since gone on to demonstrate the truth of that. And when you begin to understand there are vast differences in the Hebraic mindset versus, say, the Greek mindset, it dramatically shades and shifts what the parables were about, what they were thinking about. It's great stuff. Another great way to find more background information. And of course, the group he's been working with there, it's very accessible. It's not, it won't bury you in academic jargon. That's the kind of commentary you're looking for. And the thing that I want to warn you away from, well, not so much. You're an adult with a rational, independent mind, so you can do what you want. But most people end up going, and particularly to online resources, and the intellectually uninitiated or just the frankly lazy, go out and they find stuff like the Matthew Henry commentary. And I'm sorry, what was it? Matthew Henry was in the, 16th century or some such? And it's devotional. It's somebody's entirely subjective, line by line, verse by verse, subjective and running open, stream of consciousness dialogue. And okay, so there might be a few things in there. Hey, that's a great idea. I'd like to plagiarize that. But the fact of the matter is that it's functionally useless. It didn't really tell you anything, particularly, and I'm about 99% sure this is true, Matthew Henry is effectively a Calvinist. And so you get nothing more than a rehash of a rehash of a rehash. The nature of the commentaries that you're looking for are things that will give you genuine, true background information. A good, Erdman's, the Lasore, I assume they still publish this. The Old Testament Survey, great Old Testament survey. The Lasore, Old Erdman's, I don't remember the other three writers, but I've used that relentlessly over the course of my life. And beginning to understand what that background information was will elevate your Bible reading profoundly. I do want to make one little brief side note, and that is the use of concordances and lexicons to look up word meanings. And I'm sorry, Andy, I'm gonna maybe step on your toes just a touch, because I know this is what Andy loves. He loves parsing down Greek roots and all this kind of thing. So the challenge with using modern tools for that is that language is rarely devoid of culture. Now, you can gain insights, and it's true. There are word meanings that are not necessarily in the original translations, and based on whatever the interpretive assumptions of the original translating groups might have been, you might uncover some things that you didn't wouldn't have originally been clear. But language is not devoid of culture. Language is in context to the bigger picture. And so being able to see what that Greek root meant might be good. But seeing what that Greek root meant in a whole thought, in a whole context, much better. But understanding that that Greek root in that whole context, in that whole culture, was really and very often had its root in, say, Hebrew, understanding what that audience, those speakers would have understood infinitely better. So with these methods in mind, and I went a lot longer than I thought. That's a challenge. With these methods in mind, I'm now going to turn my attention to the book of Genesis.